Good morning, everyone. I can't be as loud as Sagar, but we are loudly, internally, Krystal, wishing him the best honeymoon ever. He's off to Japan at this very moment, so we miss him.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to go to Japan, but I would not love the trip and the jet lag.
No,
so
not interested. No, thank you. But it is.
I'm ready for that level of travel suffering.
So everyone's in for girl shows for the next, 3 shows until Thanksgiving break, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
So get ready for 4-hour-long shows.
That's right, because Emily and I, when we get together, do the longest shows ever for whatever reason.
We look at the clock and we're like, whoops.
Yep. Indeed, but there is a lot to talk about this morning. Lots of interesting stories, actually. So it's official now. Comcast is spinning off MSNBC. There's a bit of a freak out happening over there at the network. So obviously for me as a former MSNBC person, it's very, the tables have turned, one might say.
I'm excited for that segment.
Yeah, I got a lot to say there. So we'll get into that. Also, we have a look at some interesting ways that liberals are coping with Kamala Harris's loss. So we'll bring you that as well. New details about Elon and Vivek's plans. And Emily and I are going to talk about whether or not Trump is sort of overreaching and overreading, I guess, his mandate that he received in this election. The junk food lobby is gearing up to do battle with RFK Jr., an interesting report there. The ICC has now officially issued arrest warrants for both Bibi Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. So we'll bring you those details. There's also some significant developments on the domestic front with regard to Israel policy in the Senate led by Bernie Sanders. So give you those details as well. My friend Tori is going to be here. He has some very interesting reporting from inside the Kamala Harris campaign, where basically the campaign chair, like the person who was running the campaign, doesn't really like Kamala Harris and was sort of like sabotaging her from within, which is not a great thing when you're trying to win the presidency. So she was a Biden loyalist, Jen O'Malley Dillon. She was one of the people who was always like sort of smearing Kamala to the press behind the scenes, trying to undercut her and say, you have to stick with Biden because this lady's terrible and she's not electable. And then she ends up in charge of the campaign. So when you wonder why the staff never prepared Kamala, not that it's not also on Kamala to be prepared for this question of like, how are you different from Biden or what would you do differently? They didn't want her to separate from Biden because they're like Biden loyalists, Biden people. So he got some really interesting behind the scenes details there. I'm taking a look at Nancy Mace and her whole interest in the bathroom at the Capitol facility, and also how Democrats can better respond to some of these questions about transgender issues. So a lot to say on that one as well.
Yes, and Krystal, I am wondering who we could ask about MSNBC. Who do we know that might
have some connectivity there
into MSNBC? I think maybe you have thoughts on everything that's going down.
A little bit, yes. So we'll go ahead and get into that. Before we do though, guys, if you can become a premium subscriber, we would love you for it, and it would support all the exciting things that we're planning to do this year, breakingpoints.com. If you cannot become a premium subscriber, or you already are a premium subscriber, make sure you like and share the videos on YouTube. That helps us out a lot. We really want people to know about what we're up to here. We've got a lot of plans in terms of, this is one of the only big like internet shows, maybe the only big internet show that's here in DC.
Yeah.
So we're kind of uniquely positioned to, as politicians, wake up to the fact that actually like alternative media is really important and a lot of people watch it and maybe you should be engaging with that. We're kind of uniquely positioned to take advantage of that moment. So if you can like, if you can share, those things all really help us out over on YouTube.
And that is just a perfect transition to this segment, actually.
Yeah, that is so true.
This is the ripest time to support independent media. It's so important to help the political class kind of wake up to what's happening.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's go ahead and put the official news up on the screen here. So Comcast has decided and officially announced that they are going to spin off a number of their cable channels. So it's not just MSNBC. But this is a huge deal because they're keeping the NBC News brand under Comcast. The spinoff, though, will include MSNBC, raises all kinds of questions about the future of that network, which of course is really, really struggling post Kamala's loss. You know, their whole sort of theory of the world has just been dramatically undercut. You also had the whole incident with Joe and Mika going down to Mar-a-Lago. You and Ryan reported on the fact that even just an hour later, their audience were basically like, screw you, we're done here.
Significant dip.
Who could blame them?
Right.
Who could blame them? When 2 weeks earlier, you got Joe saying Trump is Hitler, and then, hey, we're making nice with him. We're restarting restarting negotiations, restarting communications with them. Yeah, so, they're really in the wilderness. And I think the fact that you have this spinoff coming right now, it genuinely raises questions about whether or not this network is even going to be able to survive into the future.
Yeah, I mean, MSNBC is one of the most interesting places in media right now because they're an old brand, an old traditional media property, cable, old in the sense of like several decades. Going back to
early 2000s. I guess they launched maybe in the late 90s.
Late 90s, yeah. I just listened to a podcast about it. It was pretty interesting, oddly enough. But Microsoft NBC, of course.
That's right.
Because why not? Why not just merge corporations and news gathering organizations? But
what could go wrong?
It seems fine. What's interesting about it, though, is that it's developed a really niche audience, but it's still trying to do kind of monoculture, big picture, reach a bunch of people in order to get, to compete with Fox News. They would have to be in prime time getting a couple million people at least each hour, and that's not happening because they started, marketing themselves to a sliver of the public, which is. The best analogy I use is it's Stephen Colbert versus Johnny Carson, right? Like everyone has more choice now. So if you can corner one demo, you can do really well, but that means you have to keep them in the bubble because they don't want the content outside the bubble. It's comfort food. Fine, it's not how I like to get my news, but if you want to break the comfort food bubble, you're gonna lose your audience.
Yeah, well, last time around, after Trump won in 2016, after the initial shock, MSNBC really dug in on the whole Russiagate drama.
CNN too.
And it was compelling, right? I mean, a lot of it was completely false and phony and a lie that they were selling their audience and stringing them along. You might think the audience would have lost trust then, but it was compelling. People were tuning in to Rachel Maddow every night to know, okay, what's the next shoe that's gonna drop? What's the next piece of evidence that we're gonna get in this grand conspiracy that they were spinning? And so even though, like I said, it was not accurate, it did make for great television, and they created a bit of a liberal juggernaut and were outpacing CNN a lot of times because they were willing to lean into that. This time around, there is no grand conspiracy. Trump is no longer a one-off. He just won. And the direction that MSNBC has pushed the party in, which has been not just to, resist Trump, but to also even more aggressively in a lot of ways, resist the Bernie left within the party and embrace the Nicole Wallaces, the Liz Cheneys of the world. Morning Joe was the beating heart of that embrace of the Never Trump movement as being central to the Democratic Party and central to the strategy of the Democratic Party. That whole notion has just been completely obliterated. So, one of the big problems they're going to face is now, without having NBC News there to assist them in any sort of news gathering, they don't really have their own news gathering operation.
It's just NBC, right?
Right. So then they're just in the hot takes business, like we are. At least we have Ryan doing real journalism and you doing real journalism.
But we're honest about it, right? That's the difference. We're fundamentally honest about it, and we say we're coming from positions of bias. And Nicole Wallace I heard her the other day talking about how objectively X, Y, and Z is disinformation. And she was talking about it with somebody hilarious. I forget exactly who it was. I think it was someone from Media Matters. And she was talking about how objectively this one fact is totally wrong. It's what are you smoking, Nicole Wallace? I mean, probably nothing. That's the sad part. She doesn't have to smoke anything to be delusional.
True.
But I mean, Fox, it's a lot of comfort food, yes. But even when you were on MSNBC, they had voices in that were from different perspectives because they knew that disagreement was good for TV. CNN is starting to try and do this again. They really minimized it during the Trump years. But MSNBC has really become an echo chamber of feds agreeing with centrist Democrats about policies, just nodding sagely.
Well, here's the thing. So just to give you a little bit of the history of MSNBC, which I'm curious what podcast you listen to because I'm curious what they had to say as well. But it started off as just to try to be a rival to CNN and just kind of straight news, right? And then they kind of stumbled into this liberal branding. It wasn't intentional from the executives at the top. But Keith Olbermann, during the Iraq War days, was he copied some of the model of sports newscasts, you know, and some of that, like that energy.
Talk radio.
And
almost.
yeah, and he really, you know, captured a moment. And so his ratings really blow up. They lean into that. Rachel Maddow comes out of, you know, that she was a regular guest on that show. She comes out of that. So they just sort of lean into, okay, this is working for us, so we're just going to keep going down this path. And I think the other big mistake that they made is in that 2016 Democratic primary fight, rather than being the venue where these things are really battled out and where you really have both sides of that Hillary versus Bernie divide represented, instead of that, they overtly sided with Hillary and the Democratic establishment. And, you know, they wanted to keep their access, and that was important to them and their business model. And ultimately, MSNBC, in the grand scheme of Comcast, is like a little blip on their bottom line. So they don't even care that much about the ratings. And, you know, Hillary is more acceptable and more comfortable for them. It's more prestigious to be aligned with these forces in the Democratic Party that have power. But in doing that, they also shut themselves off from not just the half of the country that isn't Democratic, but they also shut themselves off from the part of the party that was like young and rising and energetic, and made themselves adversarial to, you know, that wing of the party as well. So now you're slicing down your potential audience even further. And so,
while, by the way, playing into the identity politics game with Joy Reid, and it's not surprising, obviously, and like from the perspective of a genuine leftist like you were, Ryan, that they're using that as their sort of fig leaf to promote like corporatism. Of course, that's what's happening. But they went all in on the sort of cultural like progressivism.
That's right. Yeah, that's correct. And people who watch the show or have read Ryan's book, because he really, you know, literally wrote the book on this, will recall that the identity politics direction of the Democratic Party didn't come from the Bernie Sanders left. It came directly from the Hillary Clinton campaign trying to blunt the Bernie Sanders movement and using this, you know, very academic language and these niche identity issues as a way to smear Bernie and his movement as being sexist and racist and as not being truly progressive, because all they care about are these broad-based class economic issues. And, you know, that was effective in a sense. It was effective enough that Bernie felt the need to respond to some of that in 2020. But yeah, that's the identity issues have often been used, and certainly were used at MSNBC, as a way to virtue signal as if you were on the left, virtue signal as if you were progressive, while maintaining all of your corporate goodies for the donor class and an increasingly affluent base. It's funny, people were having this identity politics debate online, and Matt Iglesias pointed out, and I'm not the biggest Matt Iglesias fan, but he's correct about this. He's like, well, one way that identity politics was quite salient is that Biden picked Kamala Harris because of, you know, pressure from Jim Clyburn and, you know, sort of promises that he had made on the campaign trail about diversity. So he ends up picking this vice presidential candidate who had no demonstrated track record of electoral success and had in fact been rejected in the Democratic primary. And, you know, I pointed out, yeah, that's true, but take note of where that came from. That didn't come from the left of the party. That came from Joe Biden and the centrists. So now in the, you know, postmortems, to then turn around and try to blame the Bernie Sanders left for the identity politics that you all invented and used and weaponized against the Bernie Sanders left is just like, it's kind of too perfect. Yeah, it's kind of too perfect.
It is.
So as I mentioned before, Joe and Mika, they're the, you know, beating heart of the never Trump embrace, the Liz Cheney mode of the Democratic Party. And they had a little bit of gallows humor on the show about what this Comcast MSNBC spinoff might mean for them. Let's take a listen to that.
Our parent company, NBC Universal, plans to spin off its cable TV networks. That's according to the Wall Street Journal and people familiar with the situation. The company will separate off entertainment and news channels, including MSNBC, CNBC, USA, Oxygen, E, Sci-Fi, and the Golf Channel.
So it's spinning off.
The new cable venture will reportedly have an ownership structure that mirrors Comcast's.
I mean, I could be completely wrong. We could all be fired a year from now or whenever this happens. You never know what's going to happen.
Or tomorrow.
But in this case, though, Willie, what they're doing is what other media firms are doing. You spin off the cable channels, which 7 years ago were making a ton of money. Now they've got to figure out how to make them profitable. Disney, which by the way, huge media news. Disney has figured out now how to make streaming profitable. Peacock had an extraordinary success in the Olympics. So they're talking about spinning this off. Comcast still owns, I think Brian Roberts still owns a third of that. And because Comcast didn't jump into the bidding war like everybody else, throwing stupid money at streaming services and then watch it flop, Comcast has a ton of cash. So now they spin this off, and they're in a position to what do you all say? To get a lot of
Consolidate.
different consolidate, but also to just ramp up. And so you get a lot of people, a lot of different channels together. And so whatever that entity is going to be, there'll probably be a lot of cable channels, and they'll be in a much better position.
Yeah, this is to keep these networks like this network healthy and to keep Comcast thriving the way it is. And this is just the way it's going. People are cutting the cord, right? The cable subscribers are down across the board. This is something Bob Iger talked about last year doing.
Crystal, to your point, Willie Geist is an NBC News employee.
Oh,
and
true.
Throwing that question to him was dangerous.
True. Yeah. No, that is a great point. And, you know, one of the things that these people are going to have to reckon with is like their business model where Joe and Mika are making millions a year. You know, they've got a bunch of highly paid talent. They have large teams, production teams, you know, huge overhead costs. That business model just doesn't really work anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, as your ratings slide, and then more importantly, as cable companies start to ask themselves, like, is this really worth it for me to be paying you the cable carriage rate that is what they really depend on in terms of their budget? So yeah, they're in for it because now effectively they're basically in the same business that we are and trying to figure it out with this giant behemoth and all this overhead and all these overpaid like celebrity hosts that no one really cares about or wants to hear from. And so it's going to be difficult for them. Let's put some of the specifics up here on the screen about what the concerns are internally and how this was all delivered. So they said the prospect of being separated from NBC News has raised alarms among journalists at the company because MSNBC and CNBC routinely share reportage contributors and more, and because much of MSNBC's daytime schedule is filled with correspondents who are affiliated with the more traditional NBC News, not the opinion programs that are MSNBC's most watched properties. Let's put the next piece up on the screen. They say that they could also have to consider changing their name and familiar markings, so they may not be able to hold on to that NBC part of the MSNBC or CNBC name. Let's go ahead and put the next piece up on the screen. So they described the new company as a, quote, well-funded startup. These people indicated they would have a presence in Manhattan, but noted that executives were not certain at present where the corporation would be based.
That is brutal. A well-funded startup. And that really is, I mean, it's not a bad place to begin, by the way, because imagine if they understood new media. CNN actually does some big numbers on YouTube. Imagine if they understood new media and figured out what they could do. We're about to talk about what Piers Morgan does on his show in just a bit.
Yeah.
Like, they don't have the will to lean into what people actually really want, other than a pretty small slice of the public that wants to eat up whatever Nicole Wallace is serving day in and day out. But that's not a lot of people. It definitely exists, but it's not a lot of people. And so, yeah, I mean, you can be a well-funded startup and you can figure some of this stuff out if you're smart enough to, and if you have the like political stomach for quote unquote platforming all of these debates. But that's the question for them.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is, CNN doesn't have to live and die just by like their YouTube revenue stream because again, the numbers would not work out. Even as they get good numbers on YouTube, the numbers would not work out to support, multi-million-dollar salaries for their hosts who don't really drive views in particular. Like, no one really cares that much what Wolf Blitzer has to say at all.
A Wolf Blitzer monologue.
Large production overhead. Like, they have other revenue streams still. So this
Legal.
is, yeah. And the other thing, so let me show you this clip because to me it just demonstrates, this is Mike Barnicle, who was weighing in on this poll that came out about how many people now, oh my God, get their news from social media and from YouTube and other places other than cable news and newspapers. And what's evident to me in this conversation is that they really have never thought about this. Like, they don't get it at all. It's like a foreign world to them that they've never had to grapple with it. For the first time, they're like, holy shit, I got to wrap my head around what is going on over here.
And just before we toss to it,
Yeah.
Ryan and I talked yesterday about Joe Scarborough coming back from his announcement that Mika and he had gone down to Mar-a-Lago the next day and saying, for the first time in my life, I have seen how out of touch social media is with reality. And it's like, bro, you have been covering the news for how many years? And just now, because it affected you, you noticed that there's a disconnect between social media and the outside world?
But to me, it's actually the exact wrong time to learn that lesson, because to me, one of the big parts of this election was like, oh, actually social media does bear a lot of resemblance to the real world, that there's been a flip now where it used to be able to say, oh, what's happening on Twitter is not real life, like what's happening in these spaces is not real life. It's like, no, actually this is real life now. This is representative of something larger that's going on and not just like a niche online bubble sentiment. And that's why this election, flipping to being the podcast election, how successful that strategy was ultimately for the Trump campaign. I think it's the exact wrong time to learn that lesson. If anything, at this point, you should be saying, there actually is more going on there than I really thought. So, but he's got to protect, himself and believe that the people who are in his Rolodex
about him.
calling him are the ones who really have their finger on the pulse of what's going on out there.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Nobody cares.
Incredible. All right, let's take a listen to Mike Barnicle and how he was grappling with this.
And Mike, that's the challenge. You grew up in a newsroom like Gene grew up in a newsroom. I mean, that's a lot of challenge. That's a challenge for a lot of mainstream media sources is, do they make themselves relevant again? To hear 20% of adults who actually get influencers on social media.
I don't know
Maybe somebody who makes baskets, and while they're making baskets, they look up and say, vote for candidate X.
I don't know how we make ourselves relevant again, because we can't compete with 20-second snippets on an iPhone, walking up the street,
Morsels.
getting your entire news digest of the day in less than a minute on your phone as you're walking into the crowd with coffee in one hand and your phone in the other. I don't know how we catch up to that.
Yeah, so Gene Robinson, do you agree with Mike? Because I find this hard to believe.
Wow.
That younger voters would be more interested in getting an entertaining 20-second news snippet than watching a cable news show for 4 hours from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Come on. This seems like an easy choice to us here.
What is wrong with these people? Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that segment says so much. First of all, the example that Joe gives of like, somebody's like weaving baskets and then they look up and they're like, vote candidate X. It's like, have you literally ever been on YouTube? Have you ever listened to a podcast? Where have you been? And then Mike Barnicle, like, oh my God, they're just consuming these 20-second snippets. And the thing that's funny to me, coming out of the cable news world and into this world, is that I had the exact opposite experience of like, oh, in cable news, you have these truncated segments where you get maybe like 5 minutes in an interview. If you're gonna do, we used to do monologues at the Cycle. They had to be 3 minutes long. I was lucky if I could make 1 point effectively. And so, yeah, some of what's happening is TikTok, YouTube Shorts, like these very short snippets. That's some of what's happening, or, people on Twitter or whatever. But also some of what's happening is actually really long form, and the medium enables you to do whatever. Now, I have personally become very disenchanted with alternative media because I think a lot of it is slop, propaganda, junk, has in some ways worse incentives than mainstream media spaces. So I'm not going to act like that it's all great that like there's a transition to independent media, because I think there's a lot of problems there as well. But it's striking to me how little they have interacted with or thought about this world. And part of it, especially on the MSNBC Democratic side, part of it is that the left alternative media ecosystem all sprung up around Bernie Sanders. And since they have total like contempt and disgust for that movement and think that it's like a bunch of irrelevant, like useful idiots for Trump or whatever, since they have total contempt for that part of the party, they've always just, overlooked it, dismissed it, thought it was unimportant. And now suddenly the check is coming due and they're realizing like, oh shit, this is the world we live in and I have no idea what to do about that.
Well, they're also demanding that you take seriously people like Mike Barnicle, who's a serial plagiarist. He had to resign from the Boston Globe over a massive plagiarism scandal. He was plagiarizing George Carlin. He was lying then about plagiarizing things. It's just like, you are putting these people in front of us and nobody in this new media atmosphere, I mean, maybe boomers are still kind of okay with that. Like they get to know TV personalities, whatever else, but everybody wants way more authenticity now, meaning like if you want to put Mark Barnicle in front of people day in and day out, he's probably going to have to talk about what happened sometimes, because in like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram world, people just want to trust more than anything. Like they'll listen to a socialist tell them the news.
Right.
They just want to trust the person. Like they want to hear that, here's what I'm saying, here's what I believe. I trust that you're smart enough to make your own mind up about whether it's true.
Yeah.
And that's not the model that they operate on. And it's not clear to me. I mean, we see this at other corporations that just, one place I think continues to not quite get it, probably get in trouble for saying this, but The Hill, like still doesn't quite understand what to do with Rising, right? Because they don't understand.
They're a mess.
Right? But they don't understand what you have to do in new media. They don't understand how different it is and can't quite figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, with regard to Morning Joe too, their self-seriousness and Mike Barnicle acting like, oh, their news production, their 4-hour cable news show, which, by the way, no one is watching Morning Joe for 4 freaking hours. But anyway.
So I think some of the boomers are. Some retirees, like, posting up with 5 cups of coffee.
Don't do that. Joe Biden probably watches it for 4 hours.
That's exactly right. This is what I'm saying. This is the critical Biden demo.
But that serves my point, which is that probably no group of media figures has been more complicit in the destruction of the Democratic Party and thorough abandonment of the working class than Joe and Mika. If you think about it, how integral they were in terms of, bashing the left populist movement that organically sprung up, which was a much better response to Trumpism than the, rotting husk of neoliberalism that they were absolutely dedicated to. They're central to making never Trump Republicans, which basically only exist in cable news green rooms, central to the Democratic Party strategy. They're central to helping Joe Biden hold on to power long after he should. I mean, they cozy up to Joe Biden. They were the Biden whisperers. I mean, just totally embedded in this administration, which is devastatingly unpopular and in which obviously Joe Biden should never have been running for a second term to begin with. Even after that debate, they're still out there running cover for him, trying to keep him in, and then ultimately, being part of blocking any sort of a democratic process so that Democrats could have chosen a candidate who may have been better equipped to go up against Donald Trump. Like, they're at the scene of every major Democratic Party crime over the past, let's say, decade. And so for them to still think that their news reporting and their commentary and whatever help people to understand the world during this time period, I mean, that's why that's why their viewers have just completely fled. Because not only did you not help me understand the world, but also you've just exposed yourselves as being just complete liars, where you said the things that you thought we wanted to hear when it was convenient for you about the threat of Trump. And as someone who thinks Trump is genuinely a threat, I think that by going down to Mar-a-Lago and just instantly bending the knee like that, they also undercut the seriousness of the threat for those of us who are saying that, because it makes it look like all of us are just out here like saying what we think people want to hear. So in any case, I think, they've in a lot of ways made their own bed, and I think I do not think we will ever again see Joe and Mika have the level of power and influence that they did during the Biden administration or previous Democratic administrations, but especially during the Biden administration and during the first Trump administration. Like, I think that era is completely over.
2 final questions. One is part of the benefit, or was part of the benefit, of having MSNBC as a Comcast property, the access that you get by running a news channel? I'm genuinely curious. I have no idea whether or not that's true, but just you have like important people circling in and out. They have to be somewhat responsive. I mean, obviously they already have NBC News, but you get a little bit more leverage over Democrats. That's my second question, which is like, I saw how Rush Limbaugh and the Drudge Report shaped Republicans, shaped conservatives. Just these media these media outlets, these formats, they shape the way Republicans acted and behaved. And you were just making this point about never Trump Republicans driving messaging in the Democratic Party, partially as a response to the content on MSNBC. But is that sort of, did Comcast see part of the benefit of keeping MSNBC around as having a little bit of sway on the left?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I think, and this is, because like I said, MSNBC in the grand scheme of Comcast is like a gnat on their ass.
Right.
Like it's nothing.
Right.
And in some ways that's a positive for the network because then like even if revenue drops, like it doesn't really hurt Comcast that much. On the other hand, I think that's a big part of the reason why they ultimately made the decision they did in 2016 to be all in on the Hillary establishment side of the party, because that's also the part that, the executives at Comcast are comfy with. And that's the part they wanted to ascend. And ultimately, since MSNBC for them was mostly sort of like a prestige play, like you said, having cachet, being a voice in the room, whatever, even if the ratings and the energy were on the side of the birdie movement, and they could have done better from a business perspective. I think they could have if they had leaned into that, or at least had those voices present at all on the network. They didn't really care that much about the revenue because it was so insignificant to the overall corporate bottom line that they would rather just try to elevate the part of the party that was most comfortable for them and their class interests. So to me, that was the biggest significance of having the large like Comcast brand. On the one hand, you would think the fact that they don't have to care that much about small changes in revenue, et cetera, would be a benefit, but it actually ended up being, a detriment in terms of having a robust discussion within the Democratic Party and hosting all of those voices and being able to continue to serve some of the younger parts of the Democratic Party that were more interested in this left populist direction. I do think that it's possible if Kamala wins, because this is kind of like a prestige play for them. I do think it's possible if Kamala wins, they don't actually make this move.
Yeah.
Because then they continue to have access. It's not a problem for them in terms of if with the Trump administration coming in now, Comcast has to worry about their own corporate needs with regards to this administration. And MSNBC out there with hosts saying Trump is Hitler and he's a fascist and all of these things, that can become a problem for the larger corporate entity in terms of avoiding, regulatory backlash and the government being weaponized against them, which obviously Trump is willing to do. So I don't think the timing here is an accident. And, I suspect if Kamala, will never know, but I suspect if Kamala had won, they may not have made this move because the prestige play still would have made sense for them in the grand scheme of their corporate goals and priorities.
Say pharma advertising gets banned from television if RFK Jr. is confirmed.
I'll believe that when I see it, girl.
Same. But say it happens. Goodbye to cable news.
True.
You can't sell Boniva on MSNBC and between Rachel Maddow anymore.
Across the board. I mean, all of these networks. And that is important to point out too, is Fox obviously has a larger audience, partly because conservatives don't feel like they have representation in other mainstream places. So it was okay, this will be a magnet for all conservatives. Whereas liberals feel like they've got all kinds of places where they can go and get their news.
Well, and a lot of Dems watch Fox too, because they put Buttigieg on, they have a higher proportion of Democrats watching them, and any of the other networks have Republicans watching them.
Yeah. So, but all of these networks are facing a decline.
Yeah.
All of them are in various stages of this same level of decay, but MSNBC, it's going to be interesting to see what happens and if they're able to hold on at all, but they are not going to be the force that they were previously. And that, to me, is a really, really positive actual development.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.